Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Auxis Corporate Performance Series webinar, Reality Check, How to Develop a True Understanding of Your IT Costs. My name is Yaslin Arroyo, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. At this point, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker with Auxis, Raul Vega. Raul is the CEO of Auxis, bringing over 20 years of experience working with Fortune 50 global organizations and professional service firms. Raul is also our resident expert on all things nearshoring, with a strong record of achievement in the food and beverage, logistics, and consumer products industries. He has an extensive background in consulting and multinational experience that he will share with you in today's webinar. Before we begin, let me remind all participants we welcome your questions. Please submit them in your webinar panel at any time. We will address your questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Raul Vega. Raul?
Yaslin. Thank you, Yaslin. So welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here with you talking about the subject today. What we want to do today is really look at IT costs, but in a global and broader perspective. One of the things that's happening, and I want everybody to understand, hopefully by the end of this session, is the importance of really getting to know and have more visibility into IT cost drivers, as it really is becoming a key success factor for many organizations. So the first part of my presentation is going to talk a little bit more globally to set the foundation, and then we'll get into more of the details in the second half of the presentation. So initially, what I want to speak about is really the perspective of CEOs and where CEOs are thinking right now. And I want to reference an IBM study that was performed in 2012. IBM has been performing this study every 2 years since 2004. And one of the key questions that they ask these CEOs, and I believe in 2012 it was about 1,700 either CEOs or business organizational leaders, so including government agencies. And the question that is one of the centerpieces of the study is, what do you believe in terms of outside factors, external factors to your organization, could have the biggest impact to you over the next 3 to 5 years? And it has some very interesting results. If you look at the 2012 study, and what you see here is the responses from number one response in terms of the one that was the most, if you see here in 2012, technology came out number one. 71% of the respondents said technology had the biggest impact or could have the biggest impact to their organization over the next 3 to 5 years, which is very, very interesting. What has consistently been rated, and there's a rating here, what you see here is 1 through 9 factors, is market factors. So basically external market factors have, since the beginning of this study, always been number one, with people skills being number two until this year, or until this last study, which is pretty interesting in terms of when you think of in 2008, 2009, the global meltdown, the constant worries that we read about in terms of Europe and the economy and monetary policy and the low growth. CEOs are viewing technology as a bigger concern than any of those factors. And what's also extremely interesting is the rise of technology over the last several years since the study was done. So it went from being number 6 and climbing all the way now to number 1. So technology is just increasing in importance across the board for all companies, which is really what drives a lot of our discussion today. Some interesting quotes that also came out of the study. This is from the CEO of a French industrial firm, which basically says the biggest risk they face is technology, and if they fail to anticipate a huge technology change, they may be out of business. And I think we've seen examples of that with several companies over the last few years. I mean, just look at BlackBerry as a great example, who was in a great space, the mobile space, which is booming, yet they missed some of the technological changes and are now really struggling to survive. Just one good example. Obviously, an older example would be someone like Kodak, who's dominated the photography business and is basically a non-player now in an area that's booming because they missed the change to digital. Here's another interesting quote from a head of a government agency who basically, I think, addresses the volatility that we all see in the marketplaces, and why you need to be much more nimble. You know, I think it was pretty interesting. This person says there isn't a single day that he comes to work or she comes to work where I know what's going to happen. That seems a little extreme, but it kind of gives you the perspective of how change rapidly happens and how you need to be nimble to adapt. And technology is really a big creator of creating that agility for many organizations. And finally, there's another quote about collaboration. What we're seeing, I think we all see, is much more organization workforces are spread out. You need to work in teams. You need to be collaborative. You need to be sharing information. People are remote workforce are coming in, dialing in, and working on their mobile, their computers, their laptops, their tablets. And technology is the big driver of that. So you really need technology to really drive the new workforce. So CEOs are seeing it. They get it. It's the number one thing on their plate right now in terms of outside factors within their organization. So just to kind of put this a little bit in more perspective, I thought this was some interesting and fun data to talk about in terms of the volume of work. 204 emails have been sent in the last minute. So that's 42 emails per every human being in the globe. Pretty unbelievable. 61,000 hours of music listened on Pandora, 20 million photo views and 3 million uploads on Flickr, 100,000 tweets, 6 million views and 277,000 Facebook logins, 2 million plus searches in Google. So what you basically see is everybody wants access to information from anywhere at any time. I mean, just since we've been about 6 or 7 minutes on this presentation, the numbers are unbelievable in terms of what is happening from a telecommunications perspective and technology perspective. The other big aspect that is important, I think, is part of what you see in the CEO results of the survey results, is the speed of change is really increasing. If you go back, and this is a chart from Kleiner Perkins, the private equity firm that they presented at a conference, and it's an interesting chart. It basically talks about the big cycles of technology going back to the 60s with the mainframes and then mini computing, then the big boom in the 80s with personal computers. Then we had obviously the internet era in the 90s, and now we've got mobile that's kicked in, and now we're moving to wearable devices and everything that's happening there. So what also they talk about, and I think we all see, is the speed of technological change is just very, very rapid. We go from the smartphones, and then immediately now tablets have kicked in, and now the wearables are kicking in. And what you see is that it's moving faster, which means it's also getting more complicated, and it's harder for organizations to keep up. And this kind of chart here kind of puts it in perspective. It's from the same Kleiner Perkins analysis. And what it shows you is that through these different cycles of time, what also happens is there's exponential growth, logarithmic growth, really, in terms of the complexity in terms of units. So if you think about the old mainframes, obviously you didn't need as many mainframes as you needed mini computers, as you needed personal computers, and etc. And that's what you're seeing exploding. And when you think about wearable devices, that's exploding. So it's basically a 10 times increase, approximately, every time there's been one of these technological changes. Now what it means to us as business people is obviously a lot more complexity, a lot more things to manage. I mean, just think of security alone, maintenance, software updates. It becomes a lot more complex to handle and manage all of these devices and all the software related to it. This chart here now really, I think, also is in here really to talk about the speed of change. And what you're seeing here is really the number of global units shipped is on the vertical axis, and horizontally is time. And the green bar is really showing desktop PCs and the number of units shipped over time. And what's interesting is you can now see with notebooks and laptops when they were launched, how long it took them to catch up to the number of desktop PCs in terms of units shipped. It took quite a long time, over a decade. Now you look at tablets that were launched in really from a big perspective, and the tablet era was in 2009, 2010, and basically in just a few short years has exceeded or reached the level of laptops, but exceeded desktops, which is amazingly quick adoption. And most organizations, we don't move that fast. to handle this type of change. So the consumers and the individuals are adapting technologies, and corporations need to keep up with this because obviously it has an impact of how they want to interact with you, how they want to put orders in, how they want to do customer service. And a lot of the systems today really can't handle some of these new technologies in a good way. But the speed of change is obviously very dramatic. Now to even put it in a broader perspective, I don't know how many people are familiar with a study that the McKinsey Global Institute did in 2013, but it really shows you, and I think this also gets to the heart of the perspective of CEO and board members and why they're seeing technological change as the #1 factor. But this study analyzed disruptive technologies, and they're predicting that we're living in an era of dramatic change in terms of technology and how it can impact all aspects of life, personal and professional. And they've kind of quantified it in terms of the impact in gross domestic product, so an economic factor of what technology change can mean. And I think it's very interesting. So this first one is really the cost of the computing power of the fastest supercomputer in 1975 versus today, and the computing power that you can harness. And it was $5 million for a supercomputer with that type of processing power, which is equivalent today of an iPhone 4 that's $400. So a dramatic reduction in the cost of computing, which is what is really leading to a lot of these new technologies, is this constant lower cost with much more computing power. What this is also doing is it's making it much more democratic in terms of who can have access to the internet. So there's a prediction there will be an additional 2 to 3 billion people on the internet versus today. Today there's approximately 1 billion people, which is only approximately a quarter of the world's population. So all these new consumers, new users are expected to come into really the global economy. Knowledge workers. There's 230 million approximately knowledge workers in the world as of 2012. And one of the big things that they're seeing is the ability to automate knowledge work. And we've seen some of these things right now. If you think about, not in terms of knowledge work, but in an easier way, think of toll booth operators where they've automated that, bank tellers, they've automated that. But it's now going to be moving into the IT space. If we think of monitoring of networks, it would be a great example of work that has been automated in a lot of ways. But it's also going to go into accounting, clerical work. So tedious or routine transaction processing activities that historically over the last decade have been outsourced or maybe gone offshore could just be automated. And those workers will have to do higher value work. And they expect that to have a potential $5 to $7 trillion impact in efficiencies for organizations. Another interesting disruptive technology is related to healthcare and the Genome Project. As a perspective, it took 13 years and $2.7 billion to map the human genome. And the reason that it took so long, it was because of computing power. They just did not have the ability to process fast enough. And one of the predictions now is a dramatic impact in terms of healthcare, where they're saying that same capability is going to basically in the future, over the next decade, cost about $100 and take 1 hour, which is unbelievably dramatic impact. And what they're predicting is that this is going to really change the way healthcare works. So people will be at home, they'll be monitored, and there'll be the ability to diagnose based on the human genome much quicker and much more efficiently than today, where you have to go in, a lot of people who are sick, and take a series of tests and kind of, it's almost guesswork to find out what's wrong in some cases. That's going to be revolutionized, and it's really technology that is providing the power for that. Another interesting one is the Google car. We've all read about the Google car. I've heard about autonomous cars, and it always seemed to be kind of a far out, kind of Jetsons type expectation. But the reality is the Google car has driven over 300,000 miles in the city of Tokyo, which is one of the most congested cities in the world from a traffic perspective. And it had only one accident, and that one accident had to do with human error. So these autonomous cars are really coming, and they're coming relatively quick. is the expectation. And the one aspect where it's going to have a dramatic impact is in the number of accidents. And what are they foretelling is that really by these autonomous cars and the safety factor, it's going to have a dramatic reduction in the number of deaths potentially that can be addressed and avoided, and obviously from a lot of efficiency as well that comes on it. So dramatic changes that are really impacting businesses across all industries. These next few slides, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it really gets into, and I think it's important for people to understand, how they ranked the top 4 technologies in terms of GDP impact. The first one is the Internet of Things, which is very interesting, and it really gets into a little bit of the healthcare example I just gave. But that's basically, it's a network of low-cost sensors that really are going to monitor data and where it can be applied. And their biggest application where they think this can have the biggest GDP impact is the healthcare example I laid out. But the overall impact, they're expecting it to be $36 trillion of operating cost reduction that could potentially be addressed by the Internet of Things. The second one is mobile internet. The explosion of mobile, what it really has done is it's giving people access to the internet. And those 2 or 3 billion people that are going to come on board are going to have a dramatic impact in the growth of the global economy. And the mobile is what is driving that. 3D printing is considered to be the 3rd largest impactful technology. This is a very interesting one, but this is really getting into the printing of objects. So we all are very familiar, obviously, with laser printers and printing documents, but this will be the concept is to print objects. Could be toys. Weapons have been printed using or manufactured doing 3D printing. Even homes are now being built, which can have a dramatic impact into low-income housing. And what they're also viewing is a tremendous efficiency in the manufacturing industry, and also the ability of people to manufacture basically out of their house for different products. So this is expected to have a dramatic impact in the cost of manufacturing to the tune of $11 trillion potentially. So it's a very impactful technology. And finally, the automation of knowledge work, which I mentioned previously. In total, just these top 4 technologies are projected to have $165 trillion value, economic value. When you think of that number, it's just huge, but to put it in perspective, the global GDP today is $81 trillion. So this would basically mean a 3 times growth or 2 times the growth of the economy than versus today. So dramatic impact, and this is why technology has become so important to CEOs and what they're seeing in the changes, and why us as practitioners really need to be on top of that and get prepared, which is what this meeting is going to be about. So the other technologies, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I figured people would be interested. Advanced robotics, next generation genomics, the cloud that obviously is very relevant to our conversation today, the autonomous cars, and renewable energy. So bottom line, the world is changing rapidly. Technology is more critical than ever for competitive success and long-term viability of organizations. The complexity is exploding. It's exponential. It's much, much harder today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago to manage an IT operation at any enterprise of any significant size. And the other challenge that IT organizations are being asked to do is lead and drive innovation and transformation. And this is an area that historically has not been the role of IT. They've been a supporter. They're traditionally as part of the back office, and that change is now happening because technology is embedded in the business. It is part of the business. It's not a support. So IT organizations really need to change in terms of the way they view themselves and in their operating models. Unfortunately, from an IT perspective, spending is a challenge in terms of the investment mix. And this data is interesting data from Gartner Research that I think many of you may be familiar with. But 70% of IT budgets are spent on keeping the lights on, what they term keeping the lights on. So what does that mean? That's basically your basic operations of just running the business. What you see in this trend analysis, it goes back to 2006, is another way that Gartner looks at it, which is it breaks down IT investment between transforming the business, so really new innovation that's changing, and then growing the business, which is really organic growth, but it's really enhancements to your technology platforms, not dramatic new technologies being introduced, and then just running the business. And what's interesting is that it doesn't change. It stays basically about the same. And the big challenge for many organizations today is how do they lower the cost of running the business, keeping the lights on, so they can invest more in transformation and innovation. And that is really at the heart of the discussion we're going to be having the rest of today. So that is the big challenge for executives and particularly CIOs out there. Now, what's a common view of IT, by many businesses, is that it's a black hole. There's a black hole of IT from a spending perspective, but also from a services perspective very often. Key common question is, where's all that money going? Why are they always asking for more money? What value are we getting up from IT? That's very common. Money goes in, I don't feel like we're getting enough. It's not really doing enough for me. Any estimate I get from IT, I need to double or triple it for it to be realistic. And I hear this very often at the board levels. They have very little faith when they hear there's a big IT project that it's going to be done on time and on budget. And then finally, how do we know we're spending the right levels? That's an age-old question that is asked and really is tough to answer for many organizations. So a common response that people have when they're being asked these questions, dealing with these challenges, dealing with this level of dissatisfaction from the business, is let's benchmark ourselves. And there's all sorts of analysis that people look at. These are some Gartner charts where you'll see, okay, percentage of spending in terms of IT spending as a percentage of revenue and from an industry perspective. Or they may look at IT FTEs. How many people do we have in IT compared to people in our industry? Or they look at IT spending per employee. So they take what they've spent in IT, they divide it by the total number of employees, and they say, okay, are we at the right level? Or there's IT spend as a percentage of operating expense. And these go on, but they're relatively high level. The reality is that most benchmarking analysis has very limited value. It is too high level to really get to the substance. What we believe, and many people may be asking, well, why this is limited value? Let's get into it. The first and the basic reason, it's hard to get an apples-to-apples comparison when you're comparing companies with something as complex as IT spend, and that really gets to the heart of why these benchmarking analyses have limited value. There's big differences between company A, company B, and company C very often in how they cost their IT and where they allocate it. A good example would be sometimes they allocate it above the line into the gross margin of product costs. Not all the costs is in the SG&A line item. What they capitalize could be very different between companies, and where they bury it in their P&L could be very different. So the reality is when you focus on high-level industry comparisons, you're not really getting to the detailed baseline, which is really where you can get a true view into your comparison, how you stand versus others. So what happens with these high-level analysis, it's very easy to poke holes. And typically when analysis comes in, people are able to poke holes in it, which then feeds that we're different. I understand that I'm in the banking and this is what other people spend, but we're different for XYZ reason. And we hear that consistently cross-industry and in various size organizations. And when you're focusing at the high levels, it's very hard to refute those types of arguments. We believe there's a better approach, and that approach is really to take a complete fundamental rethink of the IT operating models. And I'd like to talk about what we mean by that. The bottom line is we believe IT needs to be run like a service business. It's not a cost center. The services that IT is providing need to take center stage, but most people don't look at IT that way. Okay, what they look at it as a cost center, which makes it very hard to then determine, is it doing a good job, is it not doing a good job, and is it priced at the right level. And IT becomes almost like a Rubik's Cube. And what needs to happen by running it as a service is it needs to be transparent, accountable, and subject to market forces. The other aspect of IT that needs to be well understood is that it's not going to be all internal or all outsourced. It's what we would call a hybrid model. The complexity that exists today in the IT world in terms of business, you cannot be an expert in everything. You need the ability to bring in outside organizations to support you, but you're going to need to be able to manage those, and that really gets into the heart of the IT costing model that we're talking about. And your IT costing really needs to go from being a high-level analysis of traditional accounting models that we'll talk about to really getting to the point where you can do unit-based pricing. So this is what we believe is required in terms of rethinking the IT operating model. The primary benefits that we think this is going to give organizations is greater visibility of their cost drivers, better demand management. What do I mean by demand management? Most organizations, if you ask their users, want more from IT. They don't necessarily want to pay for it, but they want more from IT. By going to the model that's based on services which has greater visibility of cost, you're going to be able to provide the business the information to make rational business decisions and decide, do they want to spend for that additional service or not? And you can have a business discussion and not an emotional discussion. It's going to provide a basis for more accurate and fair cost allocations. So the businesses now will really truly know what IT is costing them based on their own decisions and what they need to run that business. And then finally, and maybe most importantly at the end of the day, it's going to really allow you to get down to the accurate benchmarking so you can really figure out when you should outsource, when you should insource, what you should be paying, what you shouldn't be paying, and really get into fact-based analysis. So bottom line, IT financial models based on activity-based costing principles are a key enabler to this organization, and that's really how we're going to get into in the rest of this presentation. But without a true IT cost model that can be supported and justified, you really cannot implement a service-based organization because it will not have any credibility. So let's talk about IT cost models and the maturity and how it tends to work from an organizational perspective. Your typical, lowest level of maturity where it's really not performed. So total cost of ownership for IT is not really charged out. You basically have IT put their numbers together, but there is no charge out model. It's just a support center. It's another G&A department. The next level up, and where I think you see most people at, is there's some form of chargeback, but it's kind of a rough chargeback method. It's not really consistent, and it's not really detailed. But there may be some general allocations of IT to the business units based on headcount or revenue, and it may not even be all IT cost. So what happens with this model is it leads to a lot of pushback eventually from the business units. They want to understand why they're being charged X for their IT services, but it's very hard to justify it because the allocations are at a very high level. And this is where most companies are. They do some form of allocations, but it's not at a very detailed level, and it's through traditional cost models. The next level up, which is a dramatic improvement, but it's not the most mature process, is to do the service-based model that we're talking about in this presentation, which basically means to look at IT from a services perspective, define the services they're providing the organization, and then track the costs in accordance to the services and allocate them accordingly. So you would allocate, let's say, for example, service desk and the help desk function to the organization based on the number of users supported or maybe the number of tickets they're handling. So now when you're having that discussion with the business unit person, you can provide them information as to why the cost to them is X. And then they can say, well, how do I reduce those tickets, or how do I automate? And you can create alignment and you can have a basis for discussion. This is a dramatic improvement, a fundamental rethink of how most IT organizations work. The highest level of maturity is really when you get to either consumption-based model or unit-based pricing, where you really charge based on consumption. And this is really being driven today. A lot of times it's by the cloud providers out there who have gone to this new consumption-based models, and it's really challenging IT organizations to keep up. And most organizations are looking at that. Not many are there today. I say very few are there today, except for little aspects of their IT function. So let's talk a little bit about this cloud computing model and how it's really driving this need to understand unit-based cost. And I think it's also what's driving the need for organizations to switch to a service-based model. So a couple of good examples is storage. Let's talk about storage and the impact that the whole model of moving storage to the cloud has had. If you look in the past, say 5, 6, 7 years ago when these services first started coming out, it was about $40 per gigabyte for production level storage. Currently, that cost has been driven down where it's about $10 per gigabyte. And if you look at Amazon and their entry-level services, which they call Glacier, it's about a penny per gigabyte. So dramatic cost decreases are happening. But what's also happening is that CFOs and executives are learning about this, and their key question they ask is, well, what's our cost? And if you don't really have the service-based model with unit-based pricing, you cannot answer that question. Another good example is email. Microsoft, as we know, has come up with their 365, Office 365 model, their hosted email model. And in the past, say 5, 6, 7 years ago when they first came out, it was $14 per box, per user per box, however you would like to call it, and you got 5 gigabytes for that. Now that's $5 per box, and you get 25 gigabytes approximately. Now what's interesting is we've done several analyses, and an example from one of our clients when we start figuring out their cost models, and very often they don't know. And for one Fortune 500 client we did, their cost came in at $47 per box when we calculated. So dramatic difference and something they were unaware of, which obviously led them to moving to a hosted model just because of the cost savings. But you could not make this decision and you couldn't do this type of benchmarking unless you were able to get down to the service level and the unit of measure. So bottom line, you must really understand your costs at the unit level if you're going to make rational business decisions. In this example, the Fortune 500 company, they didn't know what it cost. And until they really were able to get comfortable with that, they could not make the decision of what was a better model and whether they were spending too much or not. So let's talk about traditional accounting and how do we really move to this new base of cost accounting for IT. Traditional accounting models, if you look at most IT organizations, they're capturing their IT budget according to these types of categories. Labor is typically the #1 cost in most IT organizations. Software, hardware, third-party services for contractors or consultants, the cost of their facilities, including the data center, training, maintenance on the hardware and the software, T&E, etc. When you're running IT like a business, the challenge is you have to look at it in a fundamentally different way. And it's really based on the services that IT is providing. So here's some examples on the infrastructure side of the house primarily. Service desk. You provide service desk, help desk services. You provide what we call workplace management, which is the desktop support area, email, mobility, telephone, server management, which is part of the data center and the network. And then there's all the application services. There are all these different services that you're providing, and your accounting system really needs to capture it in accordance to that, not the old traditional GL categories. So when you look at this running IT as a business model, you have the service categories really take center stage. And what you do is you basically have to take your IT cost allocations, the traditional accounting allocations that I just talked about, and you have to map them and get comfortable with how those allocations happen from a services perspective. At the same time, you're identifying the IT service levels that need to be provided for each one of these services to the business. And that whole combination is really what gets into a successful running IT as a business model. Now, for the scope of this discussion today, I am not going to get into the IT service level catalogs and how we develop those and how you should do your performance level. We're going to focus on the IT cost allocation model and how you really built that to support this service mentality. So an example of how you would take the service categories, and before we get into the actual cost methodology, is, here's like the service desk. So if you go to the previous slide, the service category of service desk, you then have individual services that you're providing, right? End user single point of contact service, where someone may call in, you handle the initial call on the help desk. If you can't resolve it, then you escalate it. That's a service. Incident management, service request. There's all these different types of services that can go under service desk. End user workforce management is really the desktop support that has its own level of services, and a mobility group may have its own level of services. And what's important is for each one of these service categories is you identify the unit of measure. Now the unit of measure is going to be very important to eventually get to your unit cost, but it's also very important for the customer from a performance perspective. So each level of service has different units of measure depending on what are really the drivers, the cost drivers, and the service drivers for that service. So now let's get into really the heart of the total cost of ownership methodology. And how do you do that? So you buy in, you want to do this service model. How do you get there? How do you implement this model? First thing you got to start with is you got to look at the existing way that you are capturing your cost information. And most companies today are not capturing it. I would probably say it's 90% plus of the companies that are not capturing in a service way. They're doing the traditional cost accounting model that I laid out previously. So the first thing you got to do is you got to capture all the costs from the different accounts. And it's not as easy as it sounds, because for most organizations, that IT costs are spread out around the organization. So the first thing is you got to figure out where all those costs are and start collecting them. Then you've got to basically start mapping and classifying that information into your traditional cost categories. So labor, software, etc. The idea is to get a holistic in one center of that cost for all of IT. What happens traditionally is those costs are spread out and you don't really have it. Now it could be that your IT organization does have those costs already centralized and organized this way, and that becomes a relatively easy exercise. But typically there is some work there to kind of clean that information up and get it into the right buckets. Now once you have that, you're really just at the beginning. Now you've got to map it to all these service categories. And this is a good representative sample of the different service categories. So if you haven't already defined your service categories, something that you have to do in parallel with the cost accounting cleanup is to define a service catalog for your IT organization, which we're not going to get into today, but that's very important. So once you have your IT service categories, you've kind of cleaned up your cost accounts. Now what you have to do is really start classifying and allocating all those costs to the service categories. Very often the first step is that you're going to have to adjust and reclassify a lot of those costs. So you're going to have to really align the costs with the services provider, and you're going to have to exclude some costs because some of those costs that you have captured may not be related to these services. So that's that first step, is to kind of clean that up and make sure you have the right information that is relevant to the services. Then the first step after that is to really take the direct costs that you can identify. For example, labor, you can say, okay, my help desk workers, that's a direct labor cost, and I'm going to allocate potentially the service desk. My desktop workers, the same. Engineers, maybe not so clear. They may work on multiple services. So labor in some cases may be a direct cost allocation. In other cases, it may not be. But this tends to be an easier exercise. Where the real challenge is with your indirect cost. So indirect cost could be things like training, management overhead, things like that. Facilities, potentially, is another one. And you have to figure out good methods of allocating your indirect cost. And you have to get volumetric data that really supports the allocation. So the different groups of services are really going to have different volumetrics for the allocation. And this is where, if you don't do it right, you can get a lot of pushback down the road as to the accuracy of your pricing in terms of the services you're providing to the business units. This is a little bit more art than science, and there are technologies out there to help you in different costing methodologies, and you really got to get into the maturity level you want there. Initially, companies start maybe at a higher level, and eventually, as you get more mature, you start really nailing that down with more accuracy. So that's the next key step. So once you've done those steps, you've grabbed all your cost accounting information, you've organized it, and now you've allocated your costs to your service categories, you basically now know what it costs you to deliver these services to the organization on an aggregate basis. The final step is to really take those costs and get it down to a unitized cost level. And the key thing here is to really identify the unit of measure from which you're going to apply these costs. So you really then just got to determine what that measure is, and it's just a basic math exercise of taking those costs and dividing them by the unit of measure and getting down to a unit cost that you can now present to the organization. This next slide basically gets into the details of what I just discussed. I'm going to leave this in here. I'm not going to review it in the presentation, but if people get copies, if you want copies of the presentation, which I believe we'll send out to you, this will be helpful to kind of just walking through those steps of what needs to get done. So now let's take an example of this methodology, okay? A real-world example I want to walk you through over the next few slides that really lays out how this looks. So what you see here is a traditional way of looking at IT costs. And this is from an example from one of our past clients. And what you see here is this is the way they had IT. They did have different IT cost centers within IT, sub-departments, let's call it. But when you aggregated it, this is the way they looked at it. Wage and benefits, as you can see, was a big number for them, by far the biggest number. And then you have delivery hardware, delivery software, delivery services. This is how they looked at IT. And even this had to be cleaned up to get it to this level by organizing it, like I said previously, as a first step of bringing it all together. Now, once you've gone through, when you go through the whole model that we talked about to the service level, here's how that now looks. Now when you look at your IT cost, it looks very, very different. So what you see in the upper right-hand corner in the green is service desk. So the service desk, and this is in this organization, this is primarily was done for the infrastructure operations side of the house. What you see is $3.2 million was the cost of providing service desk services to the organization, followed then by workplace management, email, and you see as you go around the different services. So as you can imagine, when you're sitting there talking to the business or talking to the CFO and you're having a conversation on the left, it really does not really provide much insight as to what's happening in IT and the value and the services they're delivering. If you're now looking at having that conversation on the right-hand side, it's a very different conversation. One of the things you find with this is when you have these types of views from a financial perspective, which are supported also from operational views of the services being provided according to these categories and the service levels, is you get less micromanagement from the executive team. They get the services, and they really are talking about how they can improve the service or reduce costs by looking at the operational side of it. In the old way, they'll basically start looking at wages and they say, well, how do we cut costs and labor? How do maybe we should reduce some of our overhead? And they start micromanaging the different cost items without regard really to the impact that it can have in terms of the delivery of services to the organization. Now for this same client, if you can hear, this is what the unitized cost looks like. So if you take that top line of service desk, that's that same $3.2 million that I highlighted, okay, what we identified as supported end users was really the key measure there. They had 13,000 of those. So when you basically divide that number, it costs them $245 per supported end users. In terms of workplace management, which is desktop support primarily, workstations were the big drivers. In mail, it's obviously the mailboxes, the end users. Mobility, same number. You look at telephony, that's the phone ports is really the driver of it. In enterprise data circuits, it's the bandwidth, server management, servers, storage, gigabytes of storage. So these volumetric measures are very important and are different depending on really what is the driver of the work and the effort and what's driving that. And when you can get to this level of information and you can really now start understanding at the unit cost, that's when you can really do a real benchmark and a real comparison like I laid out in the examples with the storage and the mailbox. So you could say, hey, this is what it's costing us. So in this case, if you look at mail, calendaring, messaging, and collaboration, it's $45. That doesn't mean that what the price you were getting on the Microsoft example is apples to apples, because you break down details in terms of, especially when you look at collaboration, then you may carve that out. But it now allows you to have a very specific conversation about that and make decisions about, do we do that in-house or not. And when you really are trying to get to the most efficient model that still provides the service to organization, because remember, our end goal is to reduce the cost of running and keeping the lights on, running the business every day, keeping the lights on, to free up money for innovation and transformation that is so important in today's business world. But without this information, you could see it's very hard to have apples-to-apples comparisons and really make those types of decisions. What this also does is it really helps you with the business units. They can really now understand that this is a business discussion you're starting to have with them. It's not about technology. It's not about stuff that they don't understand. It's not about adding servers. It's basically saying, listen, here's the service you're having. Here's what's driving it. Let's talk about how we can reduce that cost in a rational manner versus just arbitrary numbers to reduce labor or reduce software when it can't really be moved. So this is a good example on the unitized cost. Now, one thing to remember, as we get near the end of this presentation, is that when you look at the cost methodology, it can seem rather straightforward. The reality is most organizations are not that simple and straightforward. They're very complex. And these costs is in a lot of different departments. So what I wanted to show here is an example of how it could get very complicated. So what you see in the blue boxes is really where the different IT costs were captured in this particular client. So when you looked at IT, if you look on the upper left, you had the IT cost centers. So IT, the ultimate number was the IT department, but it had a software and engineering sub-department. It had a IT finance and program administration, IT operations, IT sales and marketing, etc. Where different IT costs were captured, different people were, that's how they looked at the organization. Then you had your different cost categories that I laid out that had a relationship, obviously, to the cost centers. In addition, you had projects that had different costs, and they had a whole area for projects and project costs. Sometimes the labor was allocated to that, and you had to make sure it wasn't double counted. They had a big repair and maintenance function because of their type of business. And then if you look in the middle center, they had products, and they would look at the organization in terms of products. And by organization, I mean like the IT organization. And the products were primarily software applications. So they had 41 IT products. And an example would be the pricing system, Hyperion that they use for their planning, J.D. Edwards for the financial system, PeopleSoft for HR, etc. So costs were also captured at the product level. So the challenge you had is you had to allocate and bring all these costs together and then look to allocate them to the business. Now from a business perspective, and if you see on the bottom, on the left and on the right, in more the brownish color, they had departments. There were customers of IT, mainly the back office and the SG&A departments, accounting, HR, sales, but they also had business units and different business units. They had 6 different business units that were true profit centers for the organization. So the allocation models, as you can see here, there's a lot of different relationships that need to be analyzed and looked at. So as you start getting into a much more refined way of costing, you start getting a lot of complexity potentially. That doesn't mean you should not still go forward with this model, but you may have a certain level of accuracy that you're going to have to live with unless you really want to invest in some technologies and other aspects to make this process easier from an ongoing maintenance perspective. But technology can help, and what I wanted to give here is an example of one of the leading products that's been out for a while. It's digital fuel, which this is just, I'm not advocating for digital fuel, but it just will give you, it's a good representative example of what these products can do if you're looking to implement a costing model and you have a very complex organization where you don't feel you can do it without an automated solution. And my advice would be typically that you kind of get your costing methodologies and get that agreed with, get your service catalogs, start working on it before you would look at investing at a tool. Not everybody needs it, and there's different levels of tools. Digital Fuel actually has been bought by VMware, but these kind of will give you a picture. So as you can see here, this basically allows you to basically set up cost structures, set up the objects, and really start capturing that cost accounting information that you need. So it can get data from your different operational financial systems that you need to start capturing the cost. If you don't have a tool like that, very often, and it works effectively, you can do this first analysis and using some good Excel-based models. But a tool like this obviously can help you organize the data and analyze it. Here's another example of what the tool could do, just to give you a feel for it. But as you can see down the middle, you can see the different service lines and how the cost is allocated and the percentages. So it gives you some nice reporting and a nice way to really understand where the business is operating. Here's another example of some of the cost analysis here by location that then you can slice and dice, because it's obviously in a database where you can look at it, plan versus forecast, CapEx versus operating expense. Obviously, what you get out of the tool depends on how you organize it, analyze it, and maintain it. And then it gives you a lot of the usage analysis. So these tools can be very helpful in really implementing this TCO type model in a service business. So in summary, what I would like you to leave with is technology is top of mind for CEOs and a lot of boards. If you really talk to boards today and board members, they're very concerned about the impact that technology can have on their business, and they're also very concerned about how well their organization can handle these technological changes. And a big part of their issues are historical problems that organizations have had in delivering IT projects, but also the lack of visibility that they've gotten into that function. And if you look at most board members, they really aren't as technology savvy as maybe you should be, just because of where they are in the professional career and because of the unbelievable changes that have been happening in that space. Organizations need to really lower their cost of keeping the lights on and running IT. That is a fundamental challenge, I think, to all organizations today. The reality is the IT budgets are growing, but organizations need to get more efficient so they can really free up money for innovation and transformation. IT budgets are going up, but the reality is they're just going to maintaining the status quo business primarily. That 70% number that I talked about earlier. So the challenge is, how do you really free up some money for innovation? To do that, we advocate really rethinking how you run IT and really look at it as a service business, not just as a supporting cost center, and really look at it as how it provides services. This is really what's going to maximize the value of IT to the organization and visibility. Once you're able to implement the model, you're going to look at IT differently, and I believe, and I've seen it happen, you're going to be able to free up money from keeping the lights on so you can invest in what really makes a difference in your business. Accounting models are key to making that happen, and the traditional accounting models do not work. They're not going to get you there. So you really need to rethink that. There's proven ways to do it. It's old activity-based costing applied to the IT world, and you just got to really rethink your business like we discussed today. So with that, I've wrapped up my presentation. If you're interested in learning more, we do offer a complimentary opportunity assessment for qualified organizations, where we go in and really do a quick opportunity scan, and we can give you some perspective on where you stand and what it would take to implement this type of model. If you're interested in that, you have the contact information for Pedro del Valle, and there's his email on his phone, and you can reach out to him. So with that, I would like to turn over back to Yaslin and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Raul. Yes, we do have a question from our audience. First question is, which kinds of companies are the most vulnerable to disruptive technologies in the next 10 years?
Well, that's an interesting question. The reality is, I think all industries really are vulnerable. I think if you look at the types of technologies that we're talking about, they really are cross-industry. If you look at the economic impact based on the McKinsey study, they look at healthcare as having an area which is dramatic impact. But on the other hand, if you look at knowledge workers, those are cross industries. And I think the biggest challenge is when technology comes and really changes your whole business model. So think about BlackBerry. They were leaders in the mobile space. They missed out on some technological changes, and now they're struggling to survive. If you look at the automotive industry, which is one of our oldest industries, there's a lot of changes that are happening there that are technology driven. I think most of you are probably familiar with Tesla and the way they're growing. And the reality with Tesla is that right now they have a high-end car that's relatively expensive because the cost of the batteries are very high. But they're looking at tremendous innovation in battery and energy storage, which is one of the things that McKinsey identified as disruptive technology. And when that happens, they're expecting to lower their costs to compete with very inexpensive cars. So I think it's really across industries. I don't think there's anybody who can ignore this.
Thanks, Raul. And we have another question. What is the estimated time it takes to shift from a cost-centered to service-centered model?
You know, at the end of the day, this is really a culture change. So to really get the culture embedded in an organization, I'd say it's going to take 18 to 24 months. You probably want to go through 2 cycles of planning to really get it in there, and it's a mindset change. But to really develop your initial service catalog and costing models, that's a process that can take as little as 2 to 3 months, where you can really start identifying your service catalog, rethinking what other services that are provided, get your costing model, start pricing it, and start moving the organization in that direction. But for it really to become fully embedded, fully understood by the business units, and again, this depends on a lot of other factors, the size of the organization, who's championing it, but typically it takes 18 to 24 months where people now really start getting it, and it really goes beyond the costing. Obviously, it really changes how you view IT, how IT views itself. So you have to get your IT team to really now see themselves in the service business, and that's a mind shift. It's very powerful, but not everybody makes that change. And the reason I say it's powerful because you really are taking a back office function that is looked at as a cost center, and now they start viewing themselves as really they're in the service business, and you can create incentives, and the way you run and the way you look at yourself as a worker in that department is very different and very powerful. But it takes a while. Is there any other questions, Yasmin?
Thanks, Raul. No, it looks like there are no other questions. So thank you, Raul, and to all of our participants for joining us today. Please watch for our follow-up email with the replay link along with a copy of the presentation. Also, please take a moment to complete our brief exit survey. And on behalf of Raul Vega and the Auxis team, thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.